It's interesting, isn't it? How much we naturally focus on the negatives. How quickly our brains zero in on what's wrong. And how that often becomes the main focus of our experience. Imagine for a moment how the brain works. It's like a filter, always scanning for danger, scanning for what's wrong, what's missing, what could go wrong. And often that can seem like the only thing that we notice. This is the part of us that's built to protect us, to keep us safe. But it's also the part that can sometimes get in the way of progress, isn't it? It's as if the brain doesn't know how to balance between safety and possibility. And so it sometimes makes everything feel like it's under threat. But what if just for a second we start to think about the idea of calling out the negatives? You see, there's something almost magical about it. Something extraordinary happens when you call out what's negative, not to avoid it, but to simply bring it into light. When you do that, it's like you short-circuit the power it holds over you. Because once it's acknowledged, it can't control you anymore. The brain, in this wonderful way, can actually begin to feel less threatened. As you recognize it, and maybe even smile at it, something shifts inside. It starts to lose its grip on your attention. For example, let's say you're walking through a forest and you see a snake. Now that's something that would trigger the natural fear, that instinctive response, because of the way that your brain has been conditioned to respond to dangers. But what if in that very moment you stopped and you acknowledged, hey, I'm feeling that rush of fear. I'm feeling that adrenaline spike because of the snake. What happens when you call it out? What if in doing so, the energy that it has over you starts to evaporate? And then imagine perhaps, after this moment of recognition, you realise that the rope hanging nearby isn't a snake at all, but just a rope. The brain was ready to make it into something dangerous, wasn't it? After all, that's its job. It's scanning for anything that could harm us. When it sees something that remotely looks like the snake, it doesn't even need to check before jumping into action. But now you see the power of the fear. It isn't really in the rope. It's in the meaning that we attach to it. How much the brain has been wired to notice these things. Now let's think about the power of humour. Humour is a curious thing, isn't it? It's a way of lowering defences, almost like a softening of the edges. When you use humour, especially self-effacing humour, it helps you to show your vulnerability. It invites others in because they see you as human. It's like you're saying, I'm in this with you. The funny thing is though, humour can be a powerful bridge to empathy. Because when you laugh at yourself in a light, gentle way, you invite others to feel that they don't have to be perfect either. And when you're being empathetic like this, you're really doing something powerful. You're giving people permission to let go of their own tension, not have to hold onto that weight anymore. Think about the way this works in life. When you encounter a challenge, or something that might cause a bit of tension, like we talked about earlier, humour, it can be like a tool. It lets you release the grip that the negative has on you. When you have this ability to step back and see the humour in a situation, you create a space where the brain doesn't just focus on the problem, it can see beyond it. So you end up in a situation where you're free to move forward, free to look at things differently, and free to see that the negative doesn't have to be the focus anymore. You're in control of that focus now. Now imagine this in a conversation. When you're listening to someone, instead of just hearing their words, you're actively listening, proactive listening. When you're doing this, you're anticipating, you're noticing even the subtle shifts in tone, the body language that reveals much more than the words themselves. And because you're listening on a deeper level, you're also able to guide the conversation, to help shape it in a way that's not reactive, but purposeful. When you use this kind of listening, the conversation, it almost seems to flow at ease because you're tuning into the subtle cues. the deeper meaning behind the words. It's if you're dancing with the person's thoughts, letting them guide you to the core of what they're really saying. This process works beautifully when you use it in your daily life, especially when you're dealing with those everyday challenges. Imagine you're having a conversation with someone and they bring up something negative, something they worried about, something that might trigger the response that we spoke about earlier. What if instead of just reacting, you use your proactive listening? What if instead of reacting to the negative, you simply acknowledged it, called it out with empathy, with humour, with that lightness that helps it lose its hold? And the wonderful thing about this approach is, once you start to realise how much power you have over your own responses, how much control you have over your own attention, it becomes second nature. You start seeing the negatives less as a problem to avoid, and more as an opportunity to recognise, acknowledge and move beyond. The brain, once aware of the pattern, starts to play along. You start retraining it, subtly shifting it. So instead of jumping to the worst case scenario, it naturally shifts towards curiosity, towards growth, and towards finding solutions. This is where the magic happens. This is where you become not just reactive, but proactive. As you build this belief layer by layer, you begin to notice how your response changes, how your perceptions shift, and how much more control you feel that you have in your everyday experience, because you, my friend, you're rewiring your brain, reprogramming it to move beyond the default negativity, and to step into a place of understanding, of humour, of an empowered action. Can you see it now? Can you imagine how much lighter things can feel when you no longer feel controlled by the negatives? How much more freedom you have to enjoy the positive, to create more of what you want in your life. You're not just letting go of fear, you're replacing it with the belief that you've all the tools that you need to deal with whatever comes your way. So as you continue, remember, you have the ability to call out the negative, to smile at it, to laugh at it, and in doing so, you regain control. You create an environment where you're free to choose, free to step into new possibilities, and free to live with more joy and ease.